July 9th, 2019. It's Tuesday morning in Cleveland's Slavic Village neighborhood.
Slavic Village is an area of Cleveland that was home to a lot of immigrants.
It was called Slavic Village because a lot of Eastern Europeans migrated to that area of the city.
There's still a lot of history there, but over the years, you have seen a lot of change in the dynamics and the group of people that live there.
Slavic Village is recovering from the industrial downturn, so it's on the upturn. They're trying to bring it back.
But there are still plenty of challenges.
Cleveland, it has its crime sprees, and Slavic Village is no different.
And this morning, a woman walking near her Slavic Village apartment stumbles upon a crime that has hit close to home.
Oh my God!
She found a man's body lying in a vacant lot covered in blood.
He was shot once in the head, once in the chest. Just another Cleveland homicide.
But for the woman who finds the body, the dead man is more than a statistic.
She knew the victim.
That neighborhood still has that we take care of our own type of feeling. Neighbors look out for one another.
His name is David Cousin Jr.
He had a great reputation in the community.
David's neighbor calls 911, and when the police arrive, they confirm that he's dead.
They also asked the neighbor exactly where David lived.
They go to knock on doors and see if there are witnesses.
But as the neighbor and officers approach David's house, they notice something else.
The smoke appeared to be coming from the unit where Takira Collins lived with her 2 children.
They look through those windows. There's a lot of smoke.
It looked like there had been a fire inside.
It burned itself out.
However, the fire is still a tragedy.
Hey, I see kids in there.
Life had never been easy for 25-year-old Takira Collins.
Our father, he passed when she was 1 going on 2.
You could tell it was hard on her. It affected her a lot.
In the aftermath, Takira's mother struggled to make ends meet.
Growing up in poverty, it just made things very difficult. Childhood for us was stressful.
As a result, the siblings stuck together.
She wanted us to be inseparable. She always wanted to be there for me. I always wanted to be there for her. And the older we got, the stronger we got.
But as important as their bond was, Takira longed for more.
She did want family just because she didn't have her father growing up.
By 18, she'd found what she was looking for with Armand Johnson, a young man that lived in her neighborhood.
Being from the same neighborhood and being around things and seeing things and being through things together, that made their bond, strong and tight.
The couple fell in love, and in 2012, Takira gave birth to a baby boy.
He is beautiful.
He looks like you.
You think so?
Well, he is Armand Johnson Jr.
I know she was happy.
Once her son was born, Takira devoted herself to raising the child.
Her whole mindset changed. She just wanted to do better and be better. She was just focused. She was being a mom.
But while Takira was home with their child, Armand was out in the streets.
He ended up going to jail.
He was sent away for 5 years on robbery charges.
While Armand was in prison, Takira remained focused on raising their child.
Takira Collins was a dedicated mom, and she was a hard worker. She worked multiple jobs.
She also met someone new, a man named Anthony Stevens.
Hey, I saw you sitting here and I just had to come over and meet you.
I'm glad you did.
When Takira met Anthony, she was happy, head over heels.
That first meeting quickly blossomed into a romance.
They going out, dates, and they kicking it and spending time together.
Pretty soon, they welcomed their own bundle of joy into the world. Aubrey.
She was so happy that she had a girl. Like, finally, I got a mini-me.
But Takira's relationship with Anthony didn't last either.
I turned sour, but they was together for, I'd say, about a year.
She said he became overprotective and was giving her crazy vibes, so she ended things with him.
She was a strong, independent woman.
But she still longed for her kids to have a father figure in their lives.
She ended things with Anthony, and I believe that's when the fitness for Armand started to come back.
She wanted her son's father in his life.
Her son, you know, he older now. He asking about where my dad at. Can I talk to my dad?
Takira reached out, and Armand reconnected with his son and Takira.
He was able to give her the attention she needed, explain to her how things was going to be when he came home.
He told me like, oh, we worked it out.
They got engaged, and they wanted to move forward as a family.
And when Armand finally came home, they did become a family.
Aubrey obviously was a product of a different relationship, but this little girl became his own.
Armand also doted over his little boy.
Good job, man. Yeah.
I could see that he loved his dad.
And Takira was glad to have a family again.
I said, you happy? I'm happy. That's all that matters.
Things was looking good.
But now, officers responding to a shooting have spotted smoke coming from Takira's apartment.
They went to investigate and made a horrifying discovery.
Hey, I see kids in there.
They saw the two children in the house.
They were lying motionless on the floor.
Ready?
The first responders make a forced entry, but they're too late.
Both of the children were dead from smoke inhalation.
You had a tremendous amount of smoke, which is what caused the kids to die.
But the children aren't the only victims. Moving deeper into the apartment, the officers make another grim discovery.
Police discovered Takira's body.
Unlike her children, Takira didn't die in the fire.
Takira had been shot 10 times.
Takira Collins was making a fresh start with her ex, Armand Johnson.
Armand had just finished serving 5 years in prison.
Her and Armand was back together, and things was looking good.
But now, police have found Takira and her 2 children dead inside her apartment.
Takira had been shot 10 times.
A lot of those injuries were from the back. I believe she was running to her bedroom, trying to get away.
Then the killer had apparently tried to set fire to the apartment, hoping to hide the evidence.
Since the children didn't have any visible injuries, police believe they died from smoke inhalation.
One of the huge factors in this case is the fact that this house was newly renovated and had brand new windows. There were no gaps in these windows. That was crucial because when this house was set aflame, the fire didn't get any oxygen in order for this whole structure to come down. So that's why we're not looking at a pile of rubble.
When homicide detectives arrive, they find clear evidence that the fire had been deliberately set.
There was a gas can left in her bedroom.
Detectives also recover multiple 9mm shell casings, as well as Takira's phone.
Takira's phone is laying on the sofa in the living room.
There were no indications of a robbery or any signs of forced entry.
Adding that to the number of wounds Takira suffered leads detectives to one conclusion.
This was a crime of passion.
Shooting Takira that many times was definitely personal.
10 shots is overkill.
The detectives suspect the children slept through the shooting.
But Takira's daughter woke sometime after the fire had been set.
Aubrey got up from her bed. We know that because she had soot in the bottom of her feet. And when you look at the walls in the house, you see her handprints walking down to her brother's room.
Police found the two children clinging to one another inside her brother's bedroom.
It's heartbreaking.
But did their deaths have anything to do with the murder of their neighbor, David Cousin Jr.?
After looking over the apartment where Takira and her children died, detectives went to the vacant lot nearby where the neighbor found David.
They would have been looking for shell casings and looking to see if these things were connected.
In the grass, detectives recover one more 9mm shell casing.
It was a match to the ones found in Takira's bedroom, which made detectives believe they were looking for the same shooter in both murders.
While the detectives work, onlookers start to gather outside the crime scene tape.
This had a lot of attention. There were family members showing up. Everyone from the neighborhood is out. It's a chaotic scene at this point.
The neighborhood was on edge to see 2 babies and a mother killed.
Neighbors are just as dismayed by David's murder.
People that lived in Slavic Village in that neighborhood were shocked because who would do something to David?
In his community, he was a very well-respected individual.
But other than being neighbors, there was no real connection between David and Takira.
It was just a high-by situation. This my neighbor. It was nothing like no relationship or none of that. He had a girlfriend. He was about to get married.
Hoping to learn more about Takira, detectives turn to her family who have started to gather after hearing the horrific news.
Can I see my baby?
Hey, we're so sorry for your loss.
When I get home, missed calls. It was coming from our uncle. So I called him. I asked him what's going on. And he told me, like, your sister's, she's gone. The first thing that came to my mind was, okay, well, what about the kids? Where are the kids?
Her family had just the profound sense of loss when, you didn't just lose one family member. You lost 3 and you lost babies.
But the family also says they know who did it.
Family members thought that only one person was responsible.
It had to be Anthony.
And her mother says she has proof.
She sent me a text last night about her youngest father.
Takira's mother received a text from her saying that Anthony was over the house.
And according to Takira's text, Anthony had a gun.
Cleveland detectives have reason to believe Takira Collins' ex-boyfriend, Anthony Stevens, may be responsible for the shooting and arson that killed Takira, her 2 children, and their neighbor, David Cousin Jr.
Takira's mother said she received a late-night text from her daughter that said Anthony had come by the apartment.
He had a gun and she felt threatened.
Did you tell her to call the police?
I didn't see it until this morning.
Takira's mother said she tried to call Takira as soon as she saw the text.
She didn't answer, so I came straight over.
Do you think he killed her?
It had to be Anthony.
She said if something was to ever happen to her, Arby's father did it.
Takira's mother tells the detectives that Anthony and Takira were having issues over the custody of their daughter.
She was keeping Arby from him because he just got crazier to the point where it scared her.
While detectives are talking to the family, Armand Johnson, the father of Takira's oldest child, arrives at the scene.
Where's Takira? Takira! Where's Takira?
Detectives pulled Armand aside and broke the news that Takira and the kids were dead.
Oh, no!
He said he received a late-night text, just like Takira's mother, that said Anthony had come over and he was threatening her.
No! I got a text message saying...
And also like Takira's mother, he says he hadn't seen the text until it was too late.
He was devastated with what happened.
And the detectives were afraid he would do something rash.
Where is he?
Sir,
no, where's Anthony? Anthony, I need to see him.
To keep Armand from interfering with the investigation, the detectives take him into custody.
He had an outstanding warrant for some other probation violation.
Once Armand's in custody, the detectives take him down to the station for a formal statement.
He eagerly wants to help.
Although, since he was under arrest, the detectives kept him cuffed.
Right now, you're under arrest for a warrant that you have.
The detectives begin by asking Armand about his relationship with Takira.
He explained that he'd moved in with Takira after he'd gotten out of prison.
However, Armand also says he'd moved out a couple of weeks before the murders.
Why did you leave?
Because we just had disagreements. So how has your relationship been with her recently? You guys talk?
Yeah, we talk. She still let me come see my kids.
In fact, Armand had said that he took both of the children to a family reunion in Detroit that weekend.
When was the last time you seen those two children?
Sunday when I dropped them off.
He says he didn't have any contact with Takira or the kids after that.
Then when I woke up this morning, I received a text from yesterday.
Armand said the text was about Anthony coming to the apartment and threatening her.
She never said to you what this was all about?
No.
Or why that there was such a problem between them?
No.
Finally, while he's not a suspect, the detectives wrap up the interview by asking Armand where he was the night of the murders.
He said he was home asleep.
I fell asleep right about 9:30, 10 o'clock.
Who can verify that you were home at 9:30 sleeping?
My grandmother, my aunt, my father.
They were all there?
Yes.
He has an alibi. It's not him.
But would Takira's other ex be able to say the same?
Anthony came forward and turned himself in to be questioned.
You're not under arrest. Let me make that clear. We read these to everybody because it's a criminal investigation.
After reading Anthony his rights, the detectives ask about his relationship with Takira.
It was shaky. Crazy.
When you say she was crazy, like, what do you mean by that?
It was just a point in time in my life where I wanted to have my cake and eat it too, and she wasn't with it.
Meaning you want to see other women?
Yeah.
And according to Anthony, he hadn't even seen Takira in more than a year.
When was the last time you actually spoken with Takira?
I would have to say since my daughter was months old, literally.
He was a non-factor in her life, a non-factor in his daughter's life, sadly.
Although he said that was primarily Takira's fault.
I've never reached out to her because every time I even tried to talk to her, it's an argument. It's gonna be something that I don't want it to blow up into.
So in other words, Anthony had just confirmed the custody issues that Takira's family had told the detectives about.
But does that mean they were right to suspect Anthony was her killer?
At this point, detectives confronted him with the text messages that Armand and Takira's mother received.
Anthony reads the message and denies it's true.
He maintained that he had not seen Takira and he was nowhere near her house the night before. He said that somebody was setting him up.
Who would want to jam you up in a quadruple homicide?
I have no idea. I want to find out my damn self.
Anthony also claims to have an alibi.
Mondays, I work 5 to close.
Anthony had a job making sandwiches at the time these offenses happened.
Hey, take a look at this.
When police follow up on Anthony's alibi, his story checks out.
Footage from the sub shop.
They were able to prove that Anthony was at work. There was surveillance footage. They even saw his time card.
And the texts to Takira's mother and Armand?
It's a big red herring, thrown out by the real killer.
But who? Desperate for leads, the detectives run a record search on Takira.
When you look at a victim in a case, their history can guide you to some extent as to who the perpetrator of this crime is.
When detectives look into Takira's history, they find an immediate red flag.
She had taken out an order of protection against another ex-boyfriend.
His name is Darius Murphy.
According to the protective order, Darius had been abusive.
She was beaten, she was also bitten.
Wow, great question. I just
Well, because violent things happen between you two. That's why.
Detectives investigating the murders of Takira Collins, her 2 children, and her neighbor David Cousin Jr. have just learned about an order of protection she took out against an ex-boyfriend named Darius Murphy.
In the request for the order, Takira accused Darius of abusing her.
Is there a possible connection?
Okay, take a seat there for me.
Hoping to find out, the detectives bring Darius in for an interview.
That's a round question. I just
Well, because you were a previous boyfriend with her who had a protection order issued against you, and violent things happen between you two. That's why.
Darius admits he had a relationship with Takira, but he says it was brief.
so much like August or something.
2018.
Yeah, last year.
That was after Takira broke up with the father of her daughter, Anthony, but while her boyfriend, Armand, was still in jail.
She said we might be a relationship because she was already engaged with Armand.
She told you this relationship between you and I can't go on after he gets out.
You guys can't stop.
Darius claimed that he was okay with their arrangement, but the detectives aren't so sure.
Was this an if I can't have you, no one can type of situation?
You have someone who is engaged in a crime of passion, it's jealousy, anger.
Plus, Takira claimed he'd been violent with her before.
You ever assault her? Okay. I understand.
People put this fight all the time, argue, but
Physically is what I'm asking you.
I probably bit her or something, but I never know.
She alleges you bit her on the back.
Yeah, I never
Okay.
beat her.
Of course, he'd also denied he had anything to do with Takira's murder.
So let me ask you, and I gotta ask you this. It's important. Did you go over to East 63rd Street and have a confrontation with Takira and shoot and kill her?
I never did.
Instead, Darius insists the detectives should be looking at Takira's other ex, Armand Johnson.
He said Armand was abusive, according to what Takira had supposedly told him.
She said he used to beat her black and blue, and now he used to put his hands on her in front of the kids.
A lot of times people assume having children makes a relationship better, but having children can also make a relationship an unhealthy environment because a lot of people don't want the responsibility of caring for children. And that happens with a lot of men, that they're just not ready to do that whole commitment piece.
However, Darius doesn't know if the abuse continued once Armand got out of jail.
He said he last talked to her a couple of months before the murders.
Okay. And Armand had already been out of jail.
He was out of jail now, he was talking about them, and she told me how they were doing.
According to Darius, Takira said things were going okay between her and Armand.
She didn't say nothing bad at that time.
She said she was still engaged to him?
At that time, yeah.
Could there be something to Darius's claims about an abusive relationship?
Takira had broken off the engagement.
Or was Darius simply trying to throw detectives off his trail?
Despite Darius's claims about Armand, the detectives pressed him for an alibi.
He's going to corroborate your times for Monday, July 8th through July 9th.
Curiously, Darius hesitates.
I don't want to be putting people in
Well, you're going to have to because right now you're in the middle of this.
To the detectives, it sounded like Darius was hiding something.
Hoping to find out what that might be, the detectives head back to the crime scene.
They canvassed the neighborhood, looking for surveillance cameras that could place Darius in the vicinity the night of the murders.
Police start to focus in on a McDonald's that's very close to Takira's house.
In fact, when detectives review the footage, the surveillance cameras outside the restaurant recorded Takira taking her kids through the drive-thru just hours before the murders.
You may want to check this out.
It's our last known footage, our last time we see Takira and these kids alive.
But what was interesting to detectives was what the cameras recorded a few hours later.
A man runs across the parking lot from the direction of Takira's house and gets in a waiting car.
Could this be the killer making his getaway?
Not too many people go to McDonald's and get picked up.
From the footage, it's tough to make out the man's identity.
The cameras, they're not clear enough.
However, the cameras did offer detectives a good look at the man's shoes.
We could see the design on these shoes and how specific these shoes were.
But who was the man wearing those shoes? It isn't long before the detectives get a call from someone who claims to know.
I called downtown. Hey, I got some information on this case. I know exactly who it is.
Detectives investigating the murders of Takira Collins, her 2 children, and her neighbor David Cousin Jr. have just received an urgent phone call from Takira's friend, Kayla Hodges.
I knew exactly who did it. It was no doubt in my mind.
According to Kayla, the killer was Armand Johnson, the father of Takira's oldest child.
Armand, I knew for a fact, but it just was like, damn, why you do the kids?
When Kayla comes in to sit down with the detectives, she says she always knew there was trouble in the relationship.
I could see that she wasn't happy. Like, yeah, you there, you being a father, but you not there.
She told you this?
No, not at first.
She'd tell me some stuff, but she ain't telling us everything.
Kayla says Takira also kept her family in the dark.
It's a dirty secret. And because it is cyclical, you don't want to tell someone what happened with your abuser because in a week, in a month, in a few days, things are going to be good. And you don't want them to alienate that person from your life.
But according to Kayla, the trouble between Armand and Takira got so bad that she couldn't hide it from everyone.
I got a call. I'm in the hospital. I got stitches. Got some stitches for what? Oh, Armand got mad and hit me in my lip.
Kayla says it was only then that Takira revealed the truth about Armand.
The relationship was just really, really toxic.
He wouldn't stop putting his hands on her. He was basically insecure about any relationship with any males that he thought was more than a friendship.
The perpetrator in the domestic violence feels a lack of control, but does not feel that they have done anything wrong.
And unfortunately, a lot of women don't think that they can get out of an abusive situation.
Which is why, according to Kayla, Takira was secretly relieved when Armand went to prison.
It's like when he went away, she don't have to deal with that no more.
But Kayla says that Takira's resolve weakened while Armand was away.
You start feeling bad for somebody, get to text him, writing letters. He incarcerated. That's your child's father. Because I wouldn't say I wouldn't do the same thing. I probably would have.
Over a time period, a person begins to start minimizing the negative of the relationship to the point where they're like, it wasn't that bad with this person.
And when Armand got out of prison, the couple reconciled.
He's sorry, he apologized.
but he hadn't changed at all.
He started abusing her again.
Yeah.
He's supposed to busted up her lip pretty bad, gave her a black eye, but unfortunately they kept me out of the loop. They didn't want me to do anything to Armand.
However, while Takira didn't tell her brother about the abuse, she did break off her engagement with Armand.
She was no longer going to put up with his behavior. She didn't want her kids around it.
When she was finally done and walking away, I could see a change. Like, she was happy. You could tell that she was excited for the new adventure.
That's extremely important and relevant in a case like this.
So you think Armand did this?
Oh, I'm sure of it.
The picture Kayla paints sounds plausible to detectives.
For him, it was like an all or nothing. He wanted her in his life. And what is scary about domestic violence relationships is that the most dangerous time is when you decide to leave. And we can make and pass laws, but at the end of the day, those things are just words on a piece of paper. And that's not going to protect anyone against 10 gunshots. If someone is intent on killing you because they can't have you, they're going to do it.
Question is, can detectives prove it?
They got a search warrant to Armand's grandmother's home where he was living with his aunt.
Hi, how can I help you?
Ma'am, we have a warrant to search your property.
Oh, dear. Okay. Sure, come on in.
They don't find a smoking gun, but what they do find is almost as damning.
They discovered some very distinct shoes, the same ones that were in the surveillance footage.
You look at the shoes and definitely say they're the same shoes. And then they're shoes that happen to have gasoline on them.
Whoever set the fire had spread gasoline around the apartment.
They also had blood on them as well.
Before sending the shoes off to the lab for testing, the detectives lean on Armand's aunt.
Earlier, he told police she would vouch that he was home on the night of the murder.
But under pressure from the detectives, she caves.
So was your nephew at home all night on July 8th?
Yes. Yeah. No. Well, not all night.
She admits that on the night of the murders, she picked him up at the McDonald's down the street from Takira's apartment.
I don't know that she truly knew what was going on. You don't want to believe that he's capable of what he did to these kids. That's unthinkable.
Between the aunt's story, the surveillance video, and the shoes, detectives were able to place Armand near the scene of the crime on the night of the murder.
2 days after the murders, the detectives pull Armand out of the jail cell where he's being held on a parole violation and confront him with what they've learned.
I have your aunt talking to us, telling us that she picked you up in the area at the time of this occurrence.
No, it was not.
Armand was denying that he committed these crimes.
But it's no use.
We have a video of you.
However, there was still one thing that detectives wanted to know.
The only thing I do not understand is how you could possibly burn your children alive.
Cleveland police are convinced that 26-year-old Armand Johnson killed his ex-fiancée, Takira Collins, her 2 children, and their neighbor, David Cousin Jr.
You went over there.
No, I did not.
And you killed her.
No, I did not.
Armand tries to deny it, but the detectives have proof.
Your own aunt is saying she picked you up that morning from that area right there, and she took you home.
Detectives also have surveillance video to back up his aunt's story.
Armand being captured on camera in the neighborhood at McDonald's was instrumental in the case.
But what the detectives really want is a confession.
In the interview, detectives leaned hard on the fact that Armand's own son had died.
I can understand wanting to hurt her, but not the kids. I just don't understand that part of it.
However, despite the pressure, Armand refuses to crack.
I need to talk to my lawyer.
The interview over, the detectives book Armand on 4 counts of murder.
There's an aggravated murder for Takira, for each one of the kids, and for David Cousin.
As news of the arrest spreads, the community rallies around Takira's family.
Everyone was on social media screaming, "No justice, no peace."
But as the case moves to trial, the family has a long wait ahead of them.
We had COVID in the middle from the time that this crime happened until the time it went to trial. So there were a lot of delays in addition to what you would normally have with a capital case.
When Armand goes on trial in August of 2022, the prosecutors argue that he just couldn't accept that his relationship with Takira was over.
That was the catalyst. He didn't want to be without her.
And it's been documented that he had an anger issue, that he was jealous of her, he didn't want her with anyone else.
So, on the night of the murders, he'd gone to Takira's apartment.
What do you want?
We need to talk.
No, we don't. We have nothing to talk about.
The kid's asleep.
Yeah?
I'm coming in.
No, you're not. You're not welcome here. You need to leave.
Oh, I ain't going nowhere.
Takira tried to run, but it was no use.
He fired at her at least 10 times.
Then, once Takira was dead, he'd spread gasoline around the apartment.
When you look at where that gas was distributed throughout that house, Armand Johnson absolutely intended those kids to lose their lives. He didn't want to leave any witnesses to what he had done.
The prosecutors believe that's also why Armand killed David Cousin Jr.
He was just an innocent bystander, coming in the house at the wrong time.
Armand saw him as someone who could uncover this whole event. That's why he shot and killed him.
That was just so sad that he had to lose his life.
According to the prosecutors, there's no doubt that Armand was responsible.
They had the aunt, the video, and the shoes recovered during the search that all placed him near the scene of the crime.
And that's not all the prosecutors have.
The shoes he was wearing that night had Takira's DNA on them, likely from blood spatter.
Add it all up, it's more than enough for the jury.
Armand is found to be guilty.
He received 4 life sentences without parole. I can sleep well at night knowing that he's never getting out of prison.
Takira's loved ones are less satisfied with the outcome.
It wasn't enough for me. I'm sorry. It wasn't enough. That's 4 lives, 2 adults and 2 kids. Then you still living, you still eating, you still breathing. No, that wasn't good enough for me. Still can't sleep at night.
While they still struggle to accept their loss, Takira's friends and family hope her story can help save others from a similar fate.
I don't wish this on nobody, not even my worst enemy. If you going through that situation, get out.
Pay attention to the red flags. Don't ignore the warning signs. Don't wait before it's too late.
But most of all, Takira's loved ones cherish her memory.
She was my everything. Me and her told each other everything. I don't have that no more.
Takira Lachey Collins was my best friend, and she was a beautiful person. Her kids was adorable angels, and they will be forever missed.
The hallway looked ordinary enough to disappear into memory. On most afternoons, people passed through it without giving it a second glance. Grocery bags brushed against painted walls. Footsteps echoed across the polished floor before fading behind apartment doors. Someone might pause to collect the mail, exchange a polite smile with a neighbor, or wait for the elevator while absent-mindedly studying the cracks in the ceiling. It was the kind of place that belonged to routine rather than tragedy, a quiet corridor inside an elegant apartment building in San Francisco's Pacific Heights, where life moved with reassuring predictability. But on the afternoon of January 26, 2001, that familiar hallway became something else. Within minutes, it would be transformed into a crime scene unlike almost any the city had ever witnessed. Blood would stain the walls. Torn clothing would lie scattered across the floor. Panic would replace routine, and the ordinary sounds of apartment life would dissolve into desperate screams that neighbors would later remember for the rest of their lives. When police officers finally reached the corridor, they would not be searching for an armed suspect hiding behind a door or a masked killer fleeing through the streets. Instead, they would come face to face with a massive dog still pacing through the hallway, muscles tense, jaws smeared with blood, refusing to surrender the territory it had violently claimed only moments before. The victim was not involved in organized crime. She had not uncovered a dangerous secret. She was not living a double life, nor had she made enemies capable of planning her death. She was simply returning home after buying groceries. Her name was Diane Whipple. She was 33 years old, an accomplished athlete, a respected lacrosse coach, and a woman whose future appeared to be unfolding exactly as she had imagined. Friends described her as energetic, disciplined, compassionate, and endlessly optimistic. She believed in routines, in hard work, and in treating people with kindness. Those who knew her struggled to imagine anyone wishing her harm. Yet harm had already been waiting for her. Not in the shadows. Not with a weapon hidden beneath a coat. But standing at the opposite end of a hallway, restrained by nothing stronger than the confidence of people who believed they could control what should never have been underestimated. The attack itself lasted only moments. The consequences have lasted for decades. Even today, more than 25 years later, law schools continue to analyze the case. Criminal justice professors debate its legal significance. Animal behavior experts revisit its details. Prosecutors still refer to it when discussing criminal responsibility, conscious disregard for human life, and the fine line separating negligence from murder. Because this was never just a story about dangerous dogs. It became a story about choices. About warnings ignored. About arrogance overcoming common sense. And about the devastating cost of believing that disaster always happens to someone else. Long before Diane Whipple ever stepped into that hallway, the signs had already begun to accumulate like cracks spreading beneath the surface of glass. Neighbors had complained. Visitors had expressed fear. People crossing paths with the enormous Presa Canarios described the same unsettling experience. The dogs lunged without warning. They growled with frightening intensity. They pulled against their leashes with such overwhelming strength that even adults struggled to keep their distance. Parents quietly guided their children to the opposite side of the corridor whenever they heard heavy paws approaching. Some residents delayed leaving their apartments until they were certain the dogs had disappeared. Fear became routine. Routine became acceptance. Acceptance became silence. And silence allowed danger to grow. The animals themselves were unlike the dogs most Americans recognized. Bred originally in Spain's Canary Islands, Presa Canarios were powerful working animals designed to control livestock many times their own size. Their massive heads, thick necks, muscular shoulders, and extraordinary bite force made them remarkably effective guardians when properly trained and responsibly handled. But in the wrong environment, without proper restraint or understanding, their physical capabilities could become catastrophic. These were not family pets wandering through a suburban neighborhood. They were living weapons whose strength demanded constant respect. Yet respect was exactly what seemed to be missing. The people responsible for the dogs insisted everything was under control. Again and again. Until the afternoon when control vanished forever. As investigators slowly reconstructed the events leading to Diane's death, they uncovered details stranger than anyone could have imagined. The owners caring for the dogs were not professional breeders. They were attorneys. Educated. Licensed. People who understood responsibility, liability, and the consequences of reckless decisions. But the mystery deepened further. The dogs did not truly belong to them. Instead, they were connected to an inmate serving a life sentence inside one of California's most notorious maximum security prisons. A senior member of the Aryan Brotherhood, one of America's most violent prison gangs, remained deeply involved in breeding and distributing these intimidating animals despite living behind concrete walls and steel bars. The connection sounded almost fictional. How could an imprisoned gang leader influence the lives of professionals living in one of San Francisco's wealthiest neighborhoods? Why had two successful lawyers become so deeply entangled in his affairs? Why had they gone so far as to legally adopt the inmate as an adult family member? Each answer uncovered another question. Every explanation revealed another layer of confusion. The deeper detectives looked, the stranger the story became. At first glance, Diane Whipple's death appeared to be a tragic accident involving dangerous animals. But accidents rarely come with years of warnings. They rarely involve repeated complaints. They rarely include documented incidents that almost ended in catastrophe. This case possessed all of those things. One witness remembered seeing the dogs dragging their handler across the ground. Another recalled crossing the street simply to avoid them. A visually impaired woman had previously experienced a terrifying confrontation involving the same animals and her guide dog. Delivery workers hesitated before entering the building. Residents whispered among themselves. Everyone seemed to recognize the danger. Everyone except the people who believed they knew the dogs best. Perhaps that is what makes this case so haunting. The ending feels impossible only until the earlier chapters are revealed. Then the tragedy begins to look less like fate and more like inevitability. One ignored warning becomes 2. 2 become 10. 10 become normal. And once something dangerous begins to feel normal, people stop asking whether it should exist at all. Diane herself had experienced a frightening encounter only weeks before the fatal attack. One of the dogs had lunged toward her with astonishing speed. Only the watch she happened to be wearing prevented the bite from becoming significantly worse. She mentioned the incident. She moved on. Like so many others, she likely assumed the problem would eventually be corrected. Few people expect a near miss to become the opening chapter of their own obituary. Life has a remarkable way of disguising turning points. The last ordinary morning never announces itself. The final conversation ends without ceremony. The familiar walk home feels identical to hundreds that came before it. Nothing about January 26th suggested history was waiting inside an apartment building. The weather did not issue a warning. The streets remained busy. Stores welcomed customers. Neighbors carried groceries. The city continued breathing exactly as it had the day before. Only later would people search their memories, desperately trying to identify the moment everything became irreversible. Was it when the apartment door opened? When the elevator arrived? When the leash slipped? When instinct replaced restraint? Or had the point of no return arrived years earlier, when repeated warnings were dismissed instead of taken seriously? These questions would eventually fill courtrooms. They would dominate newspaper headlines across America. They would force judges, prosecutors, legal scholars, and ordinary citizens to confront an uncomfortable reality. Can someone commit murder without personally laying a hand on the victim? Can ignoring obvious danger become a criminal act? Where does responsibility truly begin? The answers established by this case would reshape legal thinking for years to come. Yet beneath every legal argument remained a far simpler truth. A woman never made it home. Someone waited for her that evening. Someone expected to hear her keys in the lock. Someone imagined dinner, conversation, and another ordinary night together. Instead came hospital corridors, unanswered prayers, devastating phone calls, and a silence that would never again feel ordinary. True crime often begins with monsters hiding behind masks. This story begins with unlocked apartment doors, grocery bags, familiar neighbors, and a hallway that looked completely safe. Perhaps that is why it continues to unsettle people decades later. Because nothing about the setting suggested unimaginable violence. Nothing about Diane Whipple suggested she would become the center of one of the most significant criminal cases involving animal attacks in American history. And nothing about that quiet January afternoon hinted that, within moments, an ordinary walk home would become a tragedy that changed the law, transformed public attitudes toward dangerous animals, and left behind questions that still echo through courtrooms and classrooms across the United States. Before there was a verdict, before there was outrage, before there was a landmark legal precedent, there was simply a woman carrying groceries toward the place she believed was safest in the world. She never knew she was walking toward history. The neighborhood seemed designed to convince people that nothing truly terrible could happen there. Pacific Heights rose above San Francisco like a quiet promise. Wide streets curved gently along the hills, framed by elegant Victorian homes whose polished windows reflected the changing light from the bay. Mature trees lined the sidewalks, softening the sounds of passing traffic, while carefully tended gardens added bursts of color to nearly every block. On clear afternoons, the air carried the faint scent of salt drifting in from the Pacific Ocean, mixing with the aroma of fresh coffee escaping neighborhood cafes and the occasional fragrance of blooming flowers hidden behind iron gates. People came to Pacific Heights seeking stability. Doctors, lawyers, professors, business executives, retired couples who had spent decades building successful careers. Young professionals saving for futures they imagined would unfold without interruption. It was the sort of neighborhood where children learned to ride bicycles beneath watchful parents, where joggers greeted familiar faces every morning, and where neighbors recognized each other's routines almost without realizing it. The buildings were beautiful, the streets were clean, and crime statistics suggested that serious violence belonged somewhere else. Appearances, however, have always possessed an extraordinary ability to deceive. Behind polished doors and expensive addresses, ordinary human flaws remain exactly the same. Pride does not disappear because a building is elegant. Poor judgment cannot be hidden by wealth forever. Danger rarely announces itself according to postal code. The apartment building where Diane Whipple lived reflected much of the neighborhood surrounding it. It was not extravagant. It was comfortable. Residents appreciated its quiet atmosphere, its sense of community, and the reassuring familiarity that developed among people sharing the same hallways every day. Small conversations unfolded naturally near the mailboxes. Someone might hold an elevator for a neighbor carrying groceries. Others exchanged holiday cards or paused briefly to discuss work, weather, or weekend plans before disappearing behind their apartment doors. It felt like home. For Diane Whipple and her partner, Sharon Smith, it truly was. Their apartment represented far more than a physical address. It was the place where they had built a life together, one grounded in mutual respect, shared ambition, and genuine affection. Friends often described their relationship as balanced. Diane's energetic personality complemented Sharon's thoughtful nature. Where one rushed enthusiastically toward new challenges, the other approached life with careful reflection. Together, they created something remarkably ordinary. And sometimes ordinary is the greatest luxury of all. Neither woman sought public attention. Neither expected their names to become known across the country. Their days revolved around careers, friendships, exercise, shared meals, and plans for the future. They discussed vacations they hoped to take, projects they wanted to complete, and the countless small decisions that quietly shape adult lives. there was no reason to believe those plans would suddenly stop. Yet, hidden within the same building, another story had already begun unfolding. Its origins stretched far beyond San Francisco, far beyond California, all the way to one of America's most notorious maximum security prisons. Pelican Bay State Prison was built to contain men considered too dangerous for ordinary incarceration. Gang leaders, career criminals, and inmates responsible for extreme violence spent years isolated behind reinforced concrete, steel doors, and layers of security designed to prevent their influence from reaching the outside world. At least, that was the intention. Reality proved far more complicated. Among those serving time inside Pelican Bay was Paul "Corn-Fed" Schneider, a high-ranking member of the Aryan Brotherhood. Even while imprisoned, Schneider allegedly maintained influence over criminal enterprises operating beyond prison walls. According to investigators, one of those interests involved breeding exceptionally aggressive Presa Canario dogs. The arrangement puzzled nearly everyone who later examined the case. How could someone serving a life sentence remain connected to a dog breeding operation? How had communication continued? Who willingly participated? The answers pointed toward two unlikely individuals: Marjorie Knoller, Robert Noel. Unlike the hardened criminals Schneider associated with inside prison, Knoller and Noel held law degrees. They were practicing attorneys who represented Schneider in legal matters. Educated, articulate, and fully aware of the responsibilities accompanying professional status, they appeared to belong to an entirely different world. Yet those worlds gradually merged. Their professional relationship evolved into something that observers struggled to understand. The attorneys eventually completed legal paperwork making Schneider, an adult inmate approaching middle age, their adopted son. The decision baffled journalists. It puzzled legal scholars. Even those personally involved never offered an explanation that fully satisfied public curiosity. Speculation spread rapidly. Some believed financial motives existed. Others suspected emotional manipulation. Still others imagined complicated psychological dynamics impossible to verify. Whatever the truth may have been, one undeniable fact remained. Their lives became increasingly intertwined with Schneider's affairs. That connection eventually included two enormous Presa Canarios named Bane and Hero. When the dogs first arrived, they immediately attracted attention. Not because they barked excessively. Not because they escaped into the neighborhood. Simply because of their appearance. Even experienced dog owners paused when seeing them. Their bodies looked extraordinarily powerful, with broad chests, muscular shoulders, and thick necks that seemed almost too large for ordinary collars. Their heads were massive, their jaws intimidating, and their movements possessed a deliberate confidence that naturally commanded caution. Most large dogs inspire admiration. These inspired distance. Residents instinctively stepped aside whenever they appeared in the hallway. Children stared silently before moving closer to parents. Visitors unfamiliar with the building quickly noticed subtle behavioral changes among longtime tenants. People waited. Doors remained closed a little longer. Elevators departed half-empty because someone preferred taking the next ride instead of sharing confined space with the animals. No official meeting occurred. No written agreement circulated among residents. Yet everyone slowly developed the same unspoken habit. Avoid the dogs whenever possible. At first, these adjustments felt harmless. People accommodate inconvenience surprisingly well. Someone takes a different staircase. Someone delays collecting mail. Someone waits inside an apartment for another 5 minutes. Life continues. Until inconvenience becomes fear. Reports accumulated gradually. One resident described the dogs lunging unexpectedly. Another recalled hearing growls echo through narrow hallways. Several people watched the animals pull so forcefully against their leashes that maintaining control appeared almost impossible. The concerns remained remarkably consistent. The dogs were not merely large. They seemed unpredictable, powerful, difficult to restrain. Each encounter left behind an uncomfortable memory that refused to disappear entirely. Yet despite growing concern, meaningful changes never came. No muzzles. No stronger safety precautions. No acknowledgement that neighbors might possess legitimate reasons for alarm. Instead, reassurance became the default response. Everything was under control. The dogs were misunderstood. People simply overreacted. Statements like these appear repeatedly in tragedies involving preventable danger. Confidence often survives long after evidence begins contradicting it. The building itself reflected this growing tension in subtle ways invisible to outsiders. Neighbors exchanged cautious glances after passing the dogs. Conversations shifted whenever their names arose. People who once lingered comfortably in common areas became slightly quicker to reach their apartments. Nobody wanted confrontation. Most simply wanted to feel safe inside their own homes. Unfortunately, safety depends upon shared responsibility. When one person's choices affect an entire community, private decisions rarely remain private for long. The Presa Canario breed carried a reputation unfamiliar to many Americans at the time. Originating in Spain's Canary Islands, these dogs had historically worked alongside farmers handling cattle and protecting property. Their impressive physical strength served practical purposes developed over centuries. Proper breeding, training, and experienced ownership could produce disciplined working animals. Improper handling, however, dramatically increased risk. Unlike smaller breeds whose aggressive behavior might result in relatively minor injuries, dogs weighing well over 100 pounds possessed the physical capacity to inflict catastrophic damage within seconds. Animal behavior specialists consistently emphasize an important distinction. Strength alone does not create danger. Poor management of strength does. A powerful animal requires equally powerful responsibility. Every experienced handler understands this principle. According to later testimony, responsibility gradually gave way to overconfidence. Neighbors noticed. Friends noticed. Even strangers passing through the building occasionally noticed. One particularly disturbing incident involved a visually impaired resident and her guide dog. Accounts varied regarding precise details, but the encounter reinforced growing fears throughout the building. If professionally trained service animals could become targets, residents wondered what might happen next. Still, life continued. Humans possess remarkable talent for adapting to unresolved problems. People told themselves nothing truly terrible had happened yet. Tomorrow would probably resemble yesterday. Concern slowly transformed into routine. Routine created complacency. Complacency allowed risk to remain exactly where it was. Looking backward, investigators would later identify countless moments when different choices might have changed everything. A stronger leash. A properly fitted muzzle. Professional behavioral training. Relocating the animals to a more suitable environment. Listening carefully to frightened neighbors instead of dismissing them. Each possibility represented an opportunity. Each opportunity quietly disappeared. The irony became almost unbearable. Within a building occupied by educated professionals, surrounded by intelligent adults capable of recognizing obvious warning signs, the most dangerous threat was not hidden. It walked openly through shared hallways every single day. People saw it. People talked about it. People worried about it. Yet nothing substantial changed. Meanwhile, Diane and Sharon continued living the life they had worked so hard to build. Weekdays followed familiar rhythms. Morning routines. Work responsibilities. Exercise. Conversations over dinner. Weekends spent with friends or exploring the city they loved. From the outside, theirs was a life defined not by drama but by consistency. Diane remained deeply committed to athletics. Her background as a collegiate athlete had shaped far more than physical fitness. Sports taught discipline, resilience, teamwork, and determination. Whether coaching young athletes or maintaining her own active lifestyle, she believed that effort mattered. Improvement required persistence. Success demanded preparation. Those who knew her often remarked upon her optimism. She possessed the rare ability to encourage others without sounding artificial. Competition never overshadowed kindness. Achievement never diminished humility. Students respected her. Friends trusted her. Sharon loved her. None of them could have imagined how suddenly everything would change. The apartment building remained quiet. The neighborhood remained beautiful. Residents continued walking the same hallways, opening the same doors, and following the same routines. Somewhere within those routines, invisible to almost everyone, tragedy was steadily approaching. Not because fate demanded it. Not because coincidence made it unavoidable. But because warning after warning had quietly blended into the background until danger itself began to feel ordinary. And perhaps that is the most unsettling beginning any true crime story can have. Not a sudden act of evil. Not a carefully planned murder. But an entire community slowly learning to live beside something everyone feared, while convincing themselves that tomorrow would somehow be different from today. Tomorrow, however, was already waiting. There is a tendency, especially in cases that receive enormous media attention, for the victim to slowly disappear. Their name remains. Their photograph survives. The details of their death are repeated countless times. But the person they were, the ordinary mornings they lived, the dreams they carried, the people who laughed because of them, begins to fade behind headlines and courtroom testimony. Diane Whipple deserved far better than that. Long before lawyers argued over criminal responsibility and reporters crowded courthouse steps, she was simply Diane. The kind of person who naturally made others feel welcome. The kind of friend who remembered birthdays without needing reminders. The kind of coach whose encouragement stayed with young athletes years after they left the field. She had built a life not through extraordinary luck, but through quiet determination. Born on January 21, 1968, Diane Alexis Whipple grew up believing that effort mattered more than excuses. She was naturally athletic, but those who knew her best insisted talent alone never explained her success. She trained when nobody was watching. She practiced long after teammates had gone home. She treated every challenge as something to solve rather than something to fear. Sports became more than competition. They became the language through which she understood life. Winning mattered. Improvement mattered even more. As a student at St. Mary's College of California, Diane earned recognition as an exceptional lacrosse player. She possessed remarkable speed, but it was her relentless energy that truly separated her from others. She never seemed content with doing only what was required. If practice ended at 5 o'clock, she often stayed later. If teammates struggled, she offered encouragement instead of criticism. She understood that confidence could be contagious. Years later, former teammates would remember something more important than victories. They remembered how Diane made difficult days easier. She laughed often. Not politely. Not because conversation required it. She laughed with the wholehearted enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed being alive. Friends described her smile as immediate and sincere. It reached her eyes before it reached her mouth. She possessed the rare ability to make strangers feel like familiar acquaintances within minutes. There was nothing performative about her warmth. She simply cared. After college, Diane's passion for athletics naturally evolved into coaching. She wanted young athletes to experience the same confidence sports had given her. To many of her players, she became more than a coach. She became a mentor. Practices under Diane were demanding. She expected discipline. She expected effort. She expected commitment. But she never confused toughness with cruelty. Mistakes became lessons. Defeat became motivation. Every player mattered, whether they scored the winning goal or spent the game sitting quietly on the bench. Former students later described feeling seen in her presence. Diane remembered names. She noticed when someone appeared discouraged. She celebrated improvement that others overlooked. A player who finally mastered a difficult skill often received as much praise as the team's highest scorer. That was simply who she was. She believed every person deserved encouragement. Outside athletics, Diane's life reflected the same quiet consistency. She enjoyed simple routines. Morning workouts. Coffee shared with Sharon before work. Evening walks through the neighborhood. Weekend trips exploring different parts of San Francisco. Friends frequently gathered at their apartment, where conversations stretched late into the evening without anyone paying much attention to the clock. The apartment itself reflected both women. Books rested on shelves beside sports equipment. Family photographs occupied carefully chosen places. Fresh groceries usually filled the kitchen. Nothing about their home suggested extravagance. It suggested comfort. The kind of comfort built slowly through shared experiences. Sharon Smith had found in Diane someone who balanced her perfectly. Where Diane radiated spontaneous energy, Sharon often brought thoughtful calm. Neither personality overshadowed the other. Instead, they fit together naturally. Friends noticed small habits that revealed the depth of their relationship. Diane almost always reached for Sharon's hand while walking. Sharon instinctively remembered the little things Diane tended to forget. One preferred planning. The other welcomed surprises. Together they created a rhythm that felt effortless. Like every couple, they occasionally argued. Usually over ordinary things. Household chores. Busy schedules. Who had forgotten to buy something at the grocery store? Arguments rarely lasted long. Neither enjoyed carrying anger. Life, they believed, was simply too short. There was another quality people consistently mentioned when speaking about Diane. She made time. In a world increasingly consumed by deadlines and obligations, Diane somehow found room for others. If a friend needed help moving apartments, she showed up. If someone was recovering from illness, she visited. If a student lacked confidence before an important competition, she stayed after practice. She rarely asked what she would receive in return. Acts of kindness seemed almost instinctive. That generosity extended beyond people. She loved animals. Ironically, considering how history would remember her death, Diane had never been someone who feared dogs. Like many Americans, she associated dogs with companionship, loyalty, protection, joy. Friends recalled seeing her stop to greet neighborhood pets during walks. She admired their personalities. She smiled at their enthusiasm. Nothing in her life suggested someone deeply uncomfortable around animals. Which makes what happened later feel even more heartbreaking. She had no reason to believe the hallway outside her apartment concealed genuine danger. To Diane, home represented safety. She recognized neighbors. She knew familiar faces. She understood the rhythms of the building. Until one particular rhythm began changing. It started subtly. Occasional sightings of two unusually large dogs. Conversations among residents. Expressions of concern exchanged in passing. The names Bane and Heros slowly became familiar throughout the building. At first, Diane treated the situation much like everyone else. She remained cautious. She gave the animals space. She continued with daily life. Then came the incident that should have changed everything. About a month before the fatal attack, Diane experienced her own frightening encounter. One of the Presa Canarios suddenly lunged toward her. The movement happened so quickly that there was almost no time to react. Instinctively, she raised her arm. The dog's teeth struck her wrist. Fortunately, the watch she happened to be wearing absorbed much of the force. Instead of devastating injuries, she escaped with relatively minor scratches. She told friends about what had happened. Not dramatically. Not as someone convinced disaster was inevitable. More as a strange, unsettling experience. The sort of story people tell over dinner before changing the subject. Perhaps she believed it was an isolated incident. Perhaps she assumed the owners would recognize the seriousness of what had occurred. Perhaps she simply wanted to avoid conflict. Human beings often convince themselves that near disasters are unlikely to repeat. It is one of our most comforting, and sometimes most dangerous, instincts. The attack did not fundamentally alter Diane's daily routine. She continued coaching. Continued shopping. Continued walking through the same hallways. Continued believing that tomorrow would resemble yesterday. There were dreams still waiting. Friends later spoke about vacations Diane hoped to take. Professional goals she continued discussing. Plans shared with Sharon about the future. Nothing extravagant. Nothing impossible. Just the ordinary hopes that quietly shape adult life. Another season coaching. More years together. More holidays with family. More evenings spent laughing over dinner. Those plans now exist only in memory. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of violent crime lies not only in what is taken, but in everything that never receives the chance to exist. The birthdays never celebrated. The conversations never finished. The students never coached. The grandchildren never met. Entire futures disappear in a single irreversible moment. For Sharon, those absences became painfully tangible. The apartment they had shared suddenly felt impossibly quiet. Familiar routines transformed into painful reminders. A second coffee cup waiting unused. Athletic shoes resting near the door. Groceries bought for meals that would never be cooked together. Grief often hides inside ordinary objects. A favorite jacket. A toothbrush. An unfinished book lying open exactly where someone left it. The world outside continues moving. Inside the home, time seems to stop. Friends struggle to understand how someone so vibrant could vanish so suddenly. Many admitted they initially refused to believe the phone calls. There had to be a mistake. Surely the injuries were serious but survivable. Surely modern medicine could save someone as healthy and physically strong as Diane. After all, she was only 33. An athlete. A woman whose body had endured years of demanding physical training. People like Diane were supposed to recover. Instead, doctors fought against catastrophic blood loss and injuries no human body could withstand indefinitely. Medicine has limits. That afternoon, everyone involved would discover exactly where those limits existed. Looking back through Diane's life, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. She was never defined by fear. She embraced challenges. She trusted people. She believed communities functioned because neighbors respected one another. Those beliefs were not naive. They were hopeful. Hopeful people often assume others will act responsibly. They expect warnings to be taken seriously. They believe obvious dangers will eventually be corrected. In another version of this story, they would have been right. In another version, the complaints from residents would have resulted in meaningful action. The dogs would have been properly restrained. Professional intervention would have occurred. Someone would have recognized that confidence is never an adequate substitute for safety. In that version, Diane returns home carrying groceries. She unlocks her apartment door. Sharon asks how the shopping went. Dinner is prepared. Another ordinary evening quietly becomes another ordinary memory. History forgets the address. No television cameras arrive. No courtroom fills with reporters. No law school studies the case. But history rarely tells the stories that never become tragedies. Instead, it remembers the moments when ordinary lives collide with preventable disasters. And before Diane Whipple became a victim whose name would echo through courtrooms across America, she was simply a woman who believed she was coming home. She had no way of knowing that the future she had spent decades building would end only a few steps from her own front door. Friday, January 26, 2001, began like hundreds of Fridays before it. Nothing about the morning hinted that it would become one of the most infamous days in modern American criminal history. The city woke beneath a cool winter sky. San Francisco carried its usual rhythm, a rhythm shaped by commuters crossing steep streets, buses climbing impossible hills, cafes filling with early customers, and the distant sound of foghorns drifting in from the bay. January had wrapped the city in crisp air, but the afternoon promised clear weather, the kind that encouraged people to walk instead of drive. For Diane Whipple, it was simply another day. She had celebrated her 33rd birthday only 5 days earlier. Life was moving forward. There was work to do, errands to run, and the countless ordinary responsibilities that filled adulthood. Nothing suggested she was unknowingly living the final hours of her life. She moved through the day the way she always did, with purpose. People who knew Diane often noticed how quickly she walked. Years of competitive athletics had shaped even the simplest parts of her routine. She rarely wandered aimlessly. She carried herself with quiet confidence, shoulders relaxed, eyes alert, every movement efficient without appearing rushed. That afternoon she stopped to buy groceries before returning home. It was an ordinary decision. Milk. Fresh food. Items that would eventually sit inside shopping bags hanging from her hands. There was no urgency. No strange feeling. No instinct warning her to take another route. The drive, or perhaps the short walk back toward Pacific Heights, passed without incident. Traffic moved through the neighborhood as it always had. People walked dogs. Others carried shopping bags of their own. Somewhere nearby, children laughed in a park while neighbors greeted one another without realizing that only minutes later, police cars and ambulances would flood the same streets. Inside the apartment building, another routine was unfolding. Marjorie Nola prepared to take Bane and Hero outside. To anyone unfamiliar with the dogs, it may have appeared to be nothing more than a normal exercise routine. But those who lived inside the building often reacted differently. Some residents instinctively listened before opening their apartment doors. Others glanced cautiously down the hallway. A few delayed leaving altogether if they believed the dogs were nearby. Fear had quietly become part of the building's daily schedule. Bane was enormous. The Presa Canario possessed a broad chest supported by thick, muscular legs. His massive head seemed almost oversized, and every movement reflected extraordinary physical power. Unlike excitable dogs that barked constantly, Bane often projected something more unsettling. Stillness. Predators do not always announce themselves through noise. Sometimes silence feels more dangerous. Hero remained beside him. Equally imposing. Equally powerful. Together they occupied far more space than their bodies alone suggested. Anyone meeting them for the first time immediately understood why neighbors had become uneasy. Holding animals of that size required complete attention. Any distraction carried consequences. Marjorie Nola gripped their leashes. She had done this before. Many times. Perhaps routine had become confidence. Perhaps confidence had become complacency. Whatever she believed in those moments, history would later judge those beliefs with extraordinary severity. Meanwhile, Diane entered the building. She carried grocery bags filled with food for an evening she expected to spend at home. The familiar entrance required no thought. Every movement came from habit. Open the door. Walk inside. Cross the lobby. Reach the hallway. Head toward the apartment. Home was only seconds away. There are moments in every tragedy when two completely separate lives begin moving toward the same point without either side recognizing what is about to happen. This was one of those moments. One woman carrying groceries. One handler walking two massive dogs. The hallway between them shrinking with every step. Security cameras were limited. Witnesses later pieced together the sequence through testimony, physical evidence, and forensic reconstruction. As Diane approached, Bain suddenly focused his attention on her. No one can know precisely what occurred inside the animal's mind. Experts would later debate possible triggers. Movement. Instinct. Prey drive. Environmental stress. Territorial behavior. But whatever explanation existed, events unfolded almost instantly. The massive dog lunged. Not hesitated. Not barked. Lunged. The force exploded through the leash. Nola attempted to maintain control. The effort failed. A dog weighing well over 100 pounds, driven by explosive momentum, generated more power than she could overcome. Within fractions of a second, control disappeared. Bain reached Diane. She barely had time to react. The grocery bags fell. Items scattered across the hallway floor. Plastic containers burst open. Fruit rolled across polished concrete. What had been an ordinary trip home dissolved into chaos before Diane fully understood what was happening. The first bite struck with overwhelming force. Investigators later concluded that Bain targeted her neck and upper body almost immediately. Instinct took over. Diane fought back. Everything known about her personality suggests surrender was never an option. She pushed. Pulled. Attempted to shield herself. She struggled with every ounce of strength years of athletic training had built. For a brief moment, witnesses believed she might escape. Then the dog dragged her to the ground. Once a person loses balance against an animal of that size, the situation changes almost instantly. The attack became relentless. Bain continued biting. Continued tearing. Continued overpowering every attempt Diane made to protect herself. Her injuries accumulated with horrifying speed. Nearby residents froze. Some heard screams before they understood the words. Others opened apartment doors only briefly before recoiling in disbelief. The sounds echoing through the hallway did not resemble an ordinary dog bite. They reflected absolute terror. People shouted. Someone called emergency services. Another neighbor desperately searched for something, anything, that might interrupt the attack. Time slowed. Witnesses later struggled to estimate how long everything lasted. Traumatic events distort perception. Seconds feel like minutes. Minutes become impossible to measure. Some remembered Diane screaming repeatedly. Others remembered the terrifying silence that followed moments when exhaustion overtook desperate resistance. Marjorie Nola attempted to regain control. Exactly how effective those efforts were became one of the most fiercely contested issues during the criminal trial. The prosecution argued she failed to act with sufficient urgency. The defense insisted the attack overwhelmed everyone present. What remained beyond dispute was the outcome. The attack continued long enough to inflict catastrophic injuries. Blood spread rapidly across the hallway floor. Walls became stained. The violence reached a level almost impossible for ordinary witnesses to comprehend. Diane's body bore the unmistakable evidence of repeated bites delivered with tremendous force. Still she fought. That detail often becomes overlooked. Diane did not simply collapse. Physical evidence suggested movement throughout portions of the hallway. She attempted to escape. Attempted to survive. Attempted to create distance between herself and the animal determined to keep attacking. Every instinct favored life. But strength alone could not overcome overwhelming physical disadvantage. Neighbors watching the horror unfold faced impossible decisions. Approaching such a powerful animal without weapons placed additional lives at risk. Yet standing back while another human being was being mauled felt unbearable. Some later described feeling trapped by helplessness. They wanted to intervene. They simply had no safe way to do so. Emergency dispatchers received frantic calls. Descriptions came in fragments. A woman. A dog. Blood everywhere. Help. Please hurry. Every second mattered. Police officers and paramedics raced toward the address without fully understanding what awaited them. Many likely imagined a severe animal bite. Few could have anticipated the reality. When first responders arrived, the danger had not ended. Bane remained aggressive. The enormous dog continued moving through the hallway, preventing immediate access to Diane. Officers confronted an extraordinary situation. Before medical treatment could begin, the scene itself had to be secured. Drawing firearms against a dog inside a residential apartment building is an option no officer welcomes. Yet hesitation risked additional casualties. Eventually, enough control was established for paramedics to reach Diane. The scene confronting them was devastating. Years of emergency medicine prepare responders for almost every form of human injury. Even experienced professionals later acknowledged the extraordinary severity of what they encountered. Diane remained alive. Barely. Massive blood loss had already pushed her body toward irreversible shock. Her clothing had been shredded. Deep wounds covered much of her body. Every movement required immediate medical intervention. Paramedics worked with practiced urgency. Airway. Breathing. Circulation. Control bleeding. Transport. Hope. Hope became the final treatment available. As Diane was rushed towards San Francisco General Hospital, doctors prepared for the arrival of a patient suffering injuries rarely seen outside catastrophic industrial accidents or military combat. Surgeons and emergency physicians immediately began fighting to save her life. Blood transfusions. Advanced trauma care. Every available resource. The injuries, however, proved overwhelming. Medical examinations would later document 77 separate wounds across nearly her entire body. The neck injuries alone caused devastating damage. Major blood vessels had been torn. Soft tissue destruction was extensive. Despite every effort, the human body can lose only so much blood before survival becomes impossible. Approximately 5 hours after the attack began, Diane Whipple was pronounced dead. She was 33 years old. At almost the same time, another life changed forever. Somewhere inside the hospital, Sharon Smith received the news no one is ever prepared to hear. Only hours earlier, Diane had left home expecting to return with groceries. Instead, Sharon now faced a future measured not in shared plans, but in unbearable absence. The apartment they had built together would never feel the same again. Dinner would remain uncooked. The grocery bags would never reach the kitchen. The ordinary Friday evening they expected to spend together had disappeared forever. Back at the apartment building, investigators began documenting every inch of the hallway. Blood patterns, destroyed clothing, scattered groceries, broken plastic bags, personal belongings lying exactly where they had fallen during the struggle. Each photograph captured something profoundly unsettling. Not only the brutality of the attack, but its ordinary setting. This had not occurred inside an abandoned warehouse. Not in an isolated alley. Not in a remote wilderness. It had happened where people checked their mail. Where neighbors wished one another good morning. Where residents expected the greatest danger to be a misplaced package or a noisy elevator. As darkness settled over San Francisco that evening, television stations interrupted regular programming. News spread rapidly. At first, many assumed it had been a tragic accident involving dangerous dogs. By the following morning, investigators had already begun asking far more troubling questions. Questions that would eventually transform this case from a horrific animal attack into one of the most important murder prosecutions in American legal history. Because as detectives examined what happened that afternoon, they discovered something impossible to ignore. The attack itself may have lasted only minutes. But the decisions that made it possible had been unfolding for years. By the time the hallway fell silent, it no longer resembled the corridor residents had walked through every day. The transformation was almost impossible to comprehend. Only minutes earlier, people had been carrying groceries, checking their mail, unlocking apartment doors, and returning home from work. The space had been ordinary in every imaginable way. Now it looked like the aftermath of unimaginable violence. The polished floor reflected streaks of blood stretching across the corridor. One grocery bag had split open during the struggle, leaving oranges, cartons, and crushed food scattered in random directions. A set of keys lay several feet away from where they had slipped from Diane's hand. A shoe rested near the wall, separated from its owner during the desperate fight for survival. Nothing in the hallway appeared natural anymore. Every object had become evidence. The first officers arriving at the scene immediately understood they were dealing with something far beyond a routine animal attack. Police officers trained to observe details. Their eyes naturally move from one clue to another, quietly assembling a timeline before anyone speaks. But even experienced officers later admitted that the brutality inside the building was shocking. Blood-covered sections of the hallway walls at heights that indicated violent movement rather than a single collapse. The floor bore signs of a prolonged struggle. There were drag marks, footprints, smears, patterns that suggested Diane had continued fighting long after the first attack. Investigators would later conclude that she had not died where the attack began. She had struggled desperately to move. Every few feet told another chapter of the battle. One stain marked where she had fallen. Another indicated where she had attempted to rise again. Another revealed where the dog had pulled her backward. The hallway itself became a silent witness. Unlike human witnesses, physical evidence never forgets. Crime scene technicians arrived carrying cameras, measuring equipment, evidence markers, and notebooks already prepared for what they assumed would be a standard homicide investigation. Instead, they found themselves documenting one of the most unusual death scenes California had ever recorded. Every photograph mattered. Every measurement mattered. Because investigators already understood that this case would eventually face enormous public scrutiny. Questions would come. Many questions. The answers had to be supported by evidence rather than assumption. One investigator paused beside the scattered groceries. The items seemed strangely heartbreaking. A loaf of bread. Fresh produce. Simple household necessities. They represented a future measured only in hours. Someone had planned dinner. Someone expected an ordinary evening. Those plans now existed only inside unopened shopping bags. Experienced detectives often speak about the emotional weight of ordinary objects found at violent crime scenes. A child's backpack, reading glasses, an unfinished grocery list. These are reminders that victims were living ordinary lives seconds before extraordinary violence interrupted them forever. Diane's groceries became one of those reminders. Nothing about them suggested danger. Nothing about them hinted at the catastrophe unfolding only moments later. Nearby, officers carefully secured the dogs. Bain remained the primary concern. Witnesses described him as highly agitated even after the attack ended. His physical appearance alone explained why residents had lived in fear. The Presa Canario's massive body reflected generations of selective breeding for strength and control over large livestock. Power radiated through every movement. His jaws, now central to the investigation, would become crucial forensic evidence. Animal control officers arrived to assist. Handling ordinary pets requires patience. Handling a dog capable of killing an adult human demands extraordinary caution. No unnecessary risks could be taken. Eventually, both Bain and Hero were removed from the building under heavy restraint. Residents watched from apartment windows. Some remained visibly shaken. Others simply stood in silence. The sight of the dogs leaving brought little relief. Everyone understood that the real tragedy had already occurred. Inside the apartment building, detectives began speaking with witnesses one by one. Trauma affected each person differently. Some talked continuously, desperate to describe everything they had seen. Others struggled to complete sentences. Several repeatedly apologized for not doing more. One resident admitted replaying the attack over and over inside their mind, searching for a moment when intervention might have changed the outcome. Another confessed freezing completely after opening the apartment door. The guilt weighed heavily. Could they have thrown something? Distracted the dog? Helped Diane escape? Investigators gently reminded witnesses of a difficult truth. An animal that powerful represented deadly danger to anyone entering the hallway. Attempting a rescue without proper equipment might simply have created another victim. Logic, however, rarely comforts people carrying survivors' guilt. As interviews continued, a remarkable pattern began emerging. The officers expected eyewitnesses to describe only the attack itself. Instead, residents repeatedly began their statements much earlier. They spoke about previous months, previous encounters, previous warnings. The same concerns surfaced again and again. The dogs lunged. The dogs growled. The dogs frightened children. The dogs pulled violently against their leashes. The consistency immediately caught investigators' attention. Independent witnesses rarely tell identical stories unless those stories contain substantial truth. Detectives filled page after page with nearly identical descriptions. No one seemed surprised that the dogs were dangerous. Many appeared surprised only that tragedy had not happened sooner. That realization changed the direction of the investigation. At first glance, this appeared to be a fatal animal attack. Now detectives began wondering whether human decisions deserved equal attention. Crime scene investigators expanded their work. Measurements extended throughout the hallway. Blood samples were carefully documented. Pieces of torn clothing were collected. The leash became evidence. So did Diane's damaged watch. That small watch carried unexpected significance. Friends had already mentioned an earlier incident in which it had protected her wrist from one of the dogs only weeks before. Now investigators viewed it differently. Not simply as personal property, but as a physical reminder that previous warning signs existed. Every object seemed connected to a larger story. Meanwhile, Doctors at San Francisco General Hospital completed the first stages of medical examination. The injuries they documented exceeded almost every expectation. Trauma surgeons routinely treat severe dog bites. This case stood apart. The sheer number of wounds reflected repeated attacks rather than isolated bites. Deep punctures covered multiple regions of the body. Extensive tearing of soft tissue revealed enormous bite force. The neck injuries alone explained why blood loss had become almost impossible to control. Later, the formal autopsy would identify 77 separate injuries distributed across nearly the entire body. Medical examiners carefully noted something particularly important. The pattern of wounds demonstrated sustained aggression. This had not been a single defensive bite followed by retreat. It had been an extended mauling. That distinction would later become critically important during criminal proceedings. Back inside the apartment building, investigators reached Marjorie Nola. As with every major case, detectives began asking straightforward questions. What happened? What did you see? When did you lose control? The initial responses raised additional questions almost immediately. Nola maintained that she had not believed the dogs were dangerous. She described the attack as sudden and unexpected. She insisted she had attempted to stop it. Detectives listened carefully. Then they compared her statements with witness interviews already collected. Discrepancies appeared quickly. Residents described repeated frightening encounters long before Diane's death. Some recalled warning Nola directly. Others remembered discussing the dog's behavior openly inside the building. If those accounts proved accurate, claiming complete surprise would become increasingly difficult. Detectives remained careful. Early investigations demand patience. People misremember details. Trauma distorts perception. Assumptions must never replace evidence. Still, an uncomfortable possibility had begun taking shape. What if this death had not resulted solely from an unpredictable animal? What if human choices had created the conditions that made the attack almost inevitable? Outside, news crews gathered. Police tape always attracts attention. Television vans parked along nearby streets. Neighbors returning home encountered cameras before reaching their own front doors. Reporters possessed only fragments of information. Woman killed. Dog attack. Pacific Heights. Questions outnumbered confirmed facts. The story spread rapidly across local broadcasts. Then statewide. Then nationally. People struggled to understand how something so violent could happen inside one of San Francisco's most affluent neighborhoods. Phone calls flooded police departments. Some came from journalists. Others came from individuals who claimed previous encounters with the same dogs. Each call expanded the investigation. Each memory added another piece. Animal control officials began reviewing available records. Complaints surfaced. Reports of aggressive behavior. Previous incidents involving other animals. Accounts describing loss of control. Nothing alone guaranteed future violence. Together, however, they painted an increasingly troubling picture. Detectives now understood that Diane's death existed within a much larger timeline. January 26th was not the beginning. It was the culmination. The investigation widened beyond the apartment building. Attention shifted toward the dog's origins. Who owned them? Where had they come from? Why were two enormous Presa Canarios living inside a densely populated residential building? The answers surprised nearly everyone involved. Ownership traced back not simply to Nola and Robert Noel, but to Paul Schneider, a convicted member of the Aryan Brotherhood serving a life sentence at Pelican Bay State Prison. The discovery immediately transformed the investigation. Experienced homicide detectives understand that unusual connections often reveal hidden motives. Although no evidence suggested Schneider ordered or intended the attack, investigators needed to understand the relationship completely. Why would successful attorneys care for dogs connected to one of California's most notorious prison gang members? How had this arrangement developed? What responsibilities accompanied it? The questions multiplied faster than answers. Late into the evening, investigators continued processing evidence. Crime scene lights illuminated the hallway long after residents had retreated behind closed doors. Technicians worked methodically. Photograph. Measure. Collect. Label. Repeat. Every action reflected a simple understanding. Once a crime scene is released, it can never be recreated. Every overlooked detail disappears forever. Hours later, after the final evidence markers had been removed, maintenance crews faced an impossible task. Cleaning blood from walls is physically difficult. Removing tragedy from a place people call home is impossible. Residents would continue walking that hallway. Some moved away soon afterward. Others remained but admitted they never again crossed the corridor without remembering what had happened. The stains eventually disappeared. The memories never did. As midnight approached, detectives gathered for their first comprehensive briefing. The initial assumption of a tragic accident had already begun to unravel. Witnesses described repeated warnings. Medical evidence demonstrated extraordinary violence. Previous incidents suggested a known pattern of aggression. The dog's ownership introduced bizarre criminal connections reaching into California's prison system. One investigator quietly summarized what many were beginning to suspect. This case was becoming less about what the dogs had done, and more about what people had knowingly allowed to happen. That single realization would guide every step of the investigation from that moment forward. Because somewhere inside thousands of pages of witness statements, veterinary records, complaint reports, and forensic evidence, detectives believed they would eventually answer the question that mattered most. Not whether Bain had killed Diane Whipple. That much was already undeniable. The real question was whether someone else, through conscious choices made over months and years, shared criminal responsibility for her death. The morning after Diane Whipple's death, investigators returned to work with a question that would shape everything that followed. At first, the answer had seemed obvious. A dangerous dog had attacked and killed an innocent woman. The investigation, many assumed, would focus on animal control regulations, ownership records, and whether the dogs had previously bitten anyone. But by the end of the first full day, the detectives leading the case realized they were no longer investigating only the actions of an animal. They were investigating the decisions of human beings. Every homicide investigation begins by establishing a timeline. Who knew what? When did they know it? What choices did they make after learning those facts? In this case, those questions became more important than any forensic evidence collected from the hallway. The attack itself had already been witnessed. The physical injuries were documented. The cause of death was clear. What remained uncertain was whether Diane's death had been preventable. Detectives divided their responsibilities. Some focused on the apartment building. Others examined the history of the dogs. Another team began investigating Marjorie Nola and Robert Noel. The more information they collected, the more troubling the picture became. Residents of the building proved remarkably consistent in their interviews. Many spoke cautiously at first. No one wanted to exaggerate. Most understood the seriousness of accusing neighbors whose actions had now become the center of a criminal investigation. Yet despite approaching the interviews independently, witness after witness described almost identical experiences. They remembered hearing heavy paws pounding through the hallway before the dogs appeared around a corner. They remembered stepping aside to create as much distance as possible. Some admitted they routinely looked through the peephole before opening their apartment doors. If they saw Bain or Hero outside, they simply waited. Waiting had become part of daily life. One resident recalled pressing themselves against the wall while the dogs passed. Even with their owners holding the leashes, the animals strained forward with frightening determination. Their muscles tightened. Their breathing changed. Their eyes locked onto movement. The resident later admitted feeling relief only after hearing the elevator doors close. Another witness described seeing children instinctively move behind their parents whenever the dogs entered the lobby. Parents rarely needed to say anything. The dog's appearance alone encouraged caution. Fear, detectives realized, had quietly spread throughout the building long before Diane's death. One interview stood out immediately. A visually impaired resident described an earlier encounter involving her guide dog. According to her statement, the Presa Canarios had aggressively confronted the service animal. The incident had terrified her. For detectives, the importance extended beyond the specific details. It demonstrated that concerns had reached vulnerable residents well before the fatal attack. The investigation now shifted toward documentation. Witness memories mattered. Written records mattered even more. Animal control files were requested. Complaint logs were reviewed. Veterinary records were examined. Police searched for any official documentation connecting the dogs to previous incidents. Some reports described aggressive behavior. Others documented complaints from members of the public. None individually predicted homicide. Collectively, however, they established something critically important. The dogs had not developed dangerous tendencies overnight. The pattern already existed. Detectives then turned their attention toward Marjorie Nola and Robert Noel. Background investigations often reveal surprising details. This one revealed something extraordinary. Both were licensed attorneys. Both possessed professional training emphasizing responsibility, risk assessment, and legal consequences. Neither could reasonably claim ignorance regarding liability. That fact alone interested investigators. Professionals trained in law understand foreseeable danger differently than ordinary citizens. They recognize duty, negligence, responsibility. The legal implications became increasingly significant. The detectives interviewed colleagues, friends, professional acquaintances. Most described Nola and Noel as intelligent individuals. Capable, educated. No one portrayed them as reckless thrill seekers. Which raised another question. If they were intelligent enough to recognize danger, why had they continued keeping such powerful dogs inside a residential apartment building? Investigators searched for answers inside the couple's relationship with Paul Schneider. At first glance, the connection appeared almost unbelievable. Schneider remained incarcerated inside Pelican Bay State Prison, serving a life sentence while maintaining membership within the Aryan Brotherhood. How could someone imprisoned for life remain connected to two enormous dogs living hundreds of miles away? The answer required investigators to understand a world few outsiders ever see. Prison walls restrict physical movement. They do not always eliminate influence. Evidence suggested Schneider remained involved in breeding Presa Canarios through associates operating outside prison. The dogs represented more than pets. They possessed value. Financial value. Status. Reputation. Exactly how extensive Schneider's involvement remained became part of the broader investigation. Detectives obtained correspondence. Legal documents. Telephone records were appropriate. Every connection required careful examination. Then investigators uncovered one of the strangest facts in the entire case. Marjorie Nola and Robert Noel had legally adopted Schneider as their adult son. The discovery initially left detectives believing some paperwork must have been misunderstood. Adult adoption does exist under California law. It is uncommon. Adopting a convicted Aryan Brotherhood leader serving life in prison was almost unprecedented. Why had they done it? No explanation fully satisfied investigators. Some theories suggested inheritance issues. Others speculated about financial arrangements. Still others believed Schneider exercised profound psychological influence over the couple. Evidence never conclusively established a single motive. The unusual relationship nevertheless deepened investigators' concern regarding Schneider's influence over decisions involving the dogs. Meanwhile, forensic specialists completed additional analysis concerning the attack itself. Blood evidence confirmed the sequence reconstructed by witnesses. DNA testing identified the source of biological material. Veterinary examinations supported the conclusion that Bain had inflicted the majority of fatal injuries. Hero's precise role appeared more limited, though investigators concluded both dogs participated during portions of the incident. The distinction mattered legally. It changed nothing for Diane. Medical experts carefully reviewed the autopsy findings. The report painted an almost unimaginable picture. 77 separate injuries. Massive soft tissue destruction. Deep puncture wounds. Extensive tearing. Severe neck trauma. The official cause of death centered upon exsanguination, catastrophic blood loss resulting from repeated bite injuries. Emergency physicians later explained that even immediate advanced trauma care offered little chance of survival given the extent of vascular damage. The attack had been devastatingly efficient. Prosecutors quietly began reviewing the investigation. At first, possible charges seemed relatively straightforward. Involuntary manslaughter. Criminal negligence. Failure to control dangerous animals. Cases involving fatal dog attacks traditionally remained within those legal boundaries. Then investigators delivered witness statements documenting months of repeated warnings. The legal discussion changed almost immediately. One prosecutor reportedly focused on a particular concept deeply rooted within California homicide law: conscious disregard for human life. The phrase appears deceptively simple. Legally, however, it carries enormous weight. A person need not specifically intend someone's death to commit murder. Under certain circumstances, knowingly engaging in extremely dangerous conduct while deliberately ignoring obvious risks may satisfy the mental state required for second-degree murder. The theory had rarely been applied in cases involving dangerous animals. Could it work here? No one knew. The evidence continued growing. Detectives interviewed delivery workers familiar with the building. Several admitted feeling uncomfortable whenever the dogs appeared. Maintenance personnel offered similar observations. Visitors remembered unusually tense encounters. None possessed dramatic stories individually. Together they established a consistent atmosphere. The dogs intimidated almost everyone encountering them. Investigators also examined training records. Had the dogs received professional behavioral instruction? Were they properly socialized? Had experienced handlers evaluated them? Answers proved disappointing. Experts later reviewing the case criticized multiple aspects of management. Powerful working breeds require extraordinary commitment. Physical strength alone demands appropriate restraint. According to investigators, opportunities for safer handling had repeatedly been ignored. One fact continued troubling detectives. Only weeks before the fatal attack, Diane herself had experienced a frightening encounter with one of the same dogs. Friends described how her wristwatch prevented more serious injury. The incident demonstrated something crucial. The danger had directly involved the eventual victim before her death. Detectives attempted to determine whether Nola and Noel knew about that confrontation. If they had, the significance became substantial. Every additional warning strengthened the argument that future violence was foreseeable. As public interest intensified, media coverage exploded. Television networks broadcast photographs of Diane smiling beside friends. Newspapers published images of the enormous Praiser Canarios. Legal analysts debated possible criminal charges before prosecutors announced any decisions. Public opinion polarized quickly. Some viewed the incident as a terrible accident involving powerful animals. Others insisted responsibility clearly rested with the owners. Talk radio programs filled with emotional discussions. Should certain breeds be banned? Could any dog become dangerous under improper ownership? Where should legal responsibility end? The investigation remained deliberately insulated from public debate. Detectives understood media narratives often oversimplify complex evidence. Facts, not headlines, would determine criminal charges. Even so, they recognized something unusual. This case had already begun influencing national conversations long before reaching a courtroom. As investigators assembled evidence chronologically, an unmistakable pattern emerged. Complaint. Warning. Near miss. Another complaint. Another warning. Another frightening encounter. No meaningful change. Then Diane Whipple died. The sequence disturbed nearly everyone involved. Catastrophic events often appear unpredictable beforehand. This one increasingly appeared predictable. Preventable. The distinction mattered enormously. Toward the end of the investigation's early phase, detectives conducted another detailed interview with Marjorie Nola. Again, she maintained that she never believed the dogs posed deadly danger. Again, investigators compared that statement against growing evidence. Witnesses contradicted portions of her account. Previous incidents contradicted portions of her account. The cumulative history contradicted portions of her account. Detectives did not need to determine whether Nola wanted Diane to die. There was absolutely no evidence suggesting that. Instead, they confronted a different possibility. Did she knowingly ignore a danger so obvious that continuing her behavior demonstrated conscious disregard for the lives of everyone sharing that building? That question slowly transformed the entire investigation. Months earlier, detectives might never have imagined pursuing a murder theory in a fatal dog attack. Now they found themselves discussing precisely that possibility with prosecutors. Boxes of evidence accumulated. Photographs. Interview transcripts. Veterinary reports. Medical records. Animal control complaints. Every document added another piece to an increasingly compelling narrative. By the time investigators completed their initial findings, one conclusion had become impossible to avoid. Bane had delivered the fatal bites. But Bane had never chosen where to live. He had never decided to walk unrestrained through crowded residential hallways. He had never dismissed frightened neighbors. He had never ignored repeated warnings. Those decisions belonged to people. And the investigation was no longer asking whether those people had made mistakes. It was preparing to determine whether those mistakes had crossed the line into murder. For weeks after Diane Whipple's death, investigators worked through mountains of reports, witness interviews, forensic evidence, veterinary records, and legal documents. Every new piece of information confirmed that the attack itself had been horrifying. But one question still divided everyone involved. Was this simply a tragic accident involving dangerous animals? Or had the people responsible for those animals committed a crime far more serious? The answer would not come from the hallway. It would emerge from the past. Experienced homicide investigators often describe criminal cases as puzzles assembled backward. The final event is visible from the very beginning. The challenge is discovering everything that made that ending possible. With Diane's case, detectives already knew exactly how she died. Now they needed to understand why no one had prevented it. The breakthrough began almost quietly. There was no dramatic confession. No hidden surveillance video. No anonymous tip arriving in the middle of the night. Instead, it came from something much less dramatic. Consistency. As detectives compared witness statements side by side, a remarkable pattern emerged. Residents who had never spoken with one another during the investigation described almost identical encounters with Bain and Hera. One person remembered the dogs lunging violently toward strangers. Another described hearing growling echo through the apartment hallway whenever someone approached. A delivery worker recalled refusing to enter certain areas of the building unless someone accompanied him. Parents described pulling children behind them whenever the dogs appeared. Even people who struggled to remember exact dates consistently remembered one feeling: fear. That emotional consistency carried enormous evidentiary value. People often disagree about details. They rarely invent the same emotion independently. Detectives realized the atmosphere inside the building had been shaped by the dogs long before Diane's death. Fear was not an isolated reaction. It had become part of daily life. Then came another critical realization. Almost every witness believed Marjorie Knoller and Robert Knoll already knew about those fears. Some residents remembered speaking directly to them. Others recalled conversations taking place in common areas where concerns about the dogs were openly discussed. Several people insisted the warnings had been impossible to miss. If those accounts proved accurate, then the owners could not reasonably claim ignorance. The legal significance was enormous. Knowledge changes responsibility. Someone cannot consciously ignore a danger they genuinely do not know exists. But once repeated warnings establish awareness, every future decision carries greater weight. Investigators now focused intensely on reconstructing every previous incident involving Bain and Hera. One report led to another. Each complaint opened new investigative paths. Animal control personnel described encounters. Neighbors remembered frightening experiences. Visitors who had spent only brief periods inside the building nevertheless recalled the extraordinary size and aggression of the dogs. The accumulation became impossible to dismiss. No single event predicted Diane's death. Together they painted a disturbing picture. The danger had been escalating for months. Meanwhile, prosecutors quietly consulted specialists in animal behavior. Understanding the dogs themselves became essential. Experts explained that Presa Canarios were not inherently murderous animals. Millions of dogs possess tremendous physical strength without attacking innocent people. The breed alone could never explain the tragedy. Instead, specialists emphasized a different principle. Power demands responsibility. Large working breeds require experienced handling, consistent training, proper restraint, and constant awareness of surrounding environments. The greater the animal's capability, the greater the owner's obligation. That testimony shifted attention back toward human behavior. Investigators reviewed exactly how Bain and Hera had been managed. Had muzzles been used? Not consistently. Were stronger safety precautions implemented despite repeated complaints? Evidence suggested they were not. Had professional trainers successfully addressed aggressive tendencies? Investigators found little indication that effective corrective measures had occurred. Every answer strengthened the same conclusion. Risk had repeatedly been underestimated. Then detectives uncovered evidence surrounding Diane's own earlier encounter with one of the dogs. Friends confirmed the story independently. Only weeks before the fatal attack, one of the Presa Canarios had lunged toward Diane. Her wristwatch prevented far more serious injury. The incident fascinated investigators for several reasons. First, it demonstrated that Diane herself had previously become a target. Second, it reinforced the pattern of escalating aggression. Third, detectives wanted to determine whether Nola knew the incident had occurred. If she did, another warning had gone unheeded. The timeline continued growing. Complaint. Near attack. Another complaint. Another frightening encounter. Then death. At this stage, prosecutors began exploring legal theories rarely considered in cases involving dangerous animals. California law recognized implied malice. Unlike premeditated murder, implied malice does not require planning or specific intent to kill. Instead, prosecutors must demonstrate something more subtle. The defendant knowingly engaged in conduct dangerous to human life. They understood the risk. They deliberately ignored it anyway. The legal phrase appeared repeatedly throughout internal discussions. Conscious disregard for human life. Those four words slowly became the center of the case. Detectives began asking every witness slightly different questions. Not simply what happened. But what had the owners been told beforehand? Did they receive warnings? How did they respond? Were they dismissive? Defensive? Concerned? The answers varied in wording. They rarely varied in substance. People warned them. Nothing meaningful changed. Another breakthrough emerged from the investigation into Paul Schneider. Initially, detectives believed his involvement might explain motive. Instead, it explained mindset. Evidence suggested Schneider valued dogs displaying intimidating behavior. Strength. Aggression. Power. Those qualities increased status within certain criminal circles. Although investigators found no evidence Schneider ordered the fatal attack or wanted Diane harmed, his influence helped explain why Bane and Hero were viewed differently by those responsible for them. To many people, the dogs represented danger. To others, they represented prestige. The distinction proved psychologically significant. Experts later explained that owners sometimes become desensitized to increasingly dangerous behavior. What terrifies strangers gradually becomes normal. A dog dragging someone across a sidewalk becomes merely excited. Repeated lunging becomes playing. Growling becomes protective. Each rationalization moves danger another step closer to catastrophe. Detectives increasingly believed that exact process had occurred. One investigator reportedly summarized the problem in simple terms. The owners had stopped seeing what everyone else saw. The investigation then reached perhaps its most important turning point. Prosecutors organized every known warning chronologically. The resulting timeline stretched across months. Each entry represented another opportunity to prevent tragedy. Another chance to intervene. Another decision not to act. Standing before the timeline, prosecutors recognized something extraordinary. The fatal attack no longer appeared isolated. It appeared inevitable. Not because fate demanded it. Because repeated human decisions steadily increased the probability of exactly this outcome. That realization fundamentally changed the charging discussion. Involuntary manslaughter remained possible. But some prosecutors believed it no longer reflected the evidence. Negligence suggests carelessness. The timeline suggested something beyond carelessness. Repeated awareness. Repeated warnings. Repeated opportunities. Repeated failure. They returned once more to California case law. Previous murder prosecutions involving implied malice. Cases involving reckless driving. Extremely dangerous conduct. Situations where defendants knowingly endangered human life despite obvious risks. No existing precedent perfectly matched Diane's case. That presented both opportunity and danger. Filing murder charges would be unprecedented. Losing could establish the wrong legal precedent. Winning could permanently reshape criminal responsibility. The decision demanded extraordinary confidence. District attorneys debated strategy intensely. Could a jury accept that someone committed murder without personally striking the victim? Would jurors understand implied malice? Would they distinguish between tragic accident and criminal disregard? The evidence continued pointing toward the same answer. Eventually, prosecutors reached their conclusion. Marjorie Nola would face a charge few expected to hear. Second-degree murder. The announcement stunned legal observers nationwide. Television commentators immediately described the decision as historic. Defense attorneys criticized the prosecution for stretching homicide law beyond its intended limits. Victims' advocates argued the charges finally reflected the seriousness of what had happened. Public reaction divided sharply. Some believed prosecutors had gone too far. Others believed they had finally recognized an obvious truth. Through it all, investigators remained focused on evidence rather than opinion. Robert Noel faced different charges. Although prosecutors believed he shared responsibility for keeping dangerous animals, evidence regarding his direct involvement differed from Nola's. The distinction reflected legal nuance rather than moral judgment. Every defendant would answer only for conduct supported by available evidence. As preparations for trial accelerated, another development strengthened the prosecution's confidence. Experts reviewing the physical evidence concluded the attack itself reflected extraordinary force and persistence. This mattered because defense attorneys suggested no reasonable person could have anticipated such catastrophic violence. Medical experts disagreed. Given the dog's size, strength, documented aggression, and previous behavior, the potential for fatal injury had always existed. The attack may have been shocking. Its possibility was not unforeseeable. Investigators now possessed something every prosecutor hopes to build. A complete narrative. Not speculation. Not isolated facts. A coherent sequence supported by independent evidence. Dangerous dogs. Repeated warnings. Growing public concern. Prior aggressive incidents. Failure to implement meaningful safeguards. A fatal attack. Everything connected. Everything pointed in the same direction. The breakthrough was never one dramatic discovery. It was the moment every separate piece finally aligned. By the time detectives delivered the completed investigative file to prosecutors, the case had transformed completely from where it had begun. It was no longer simply the story of an animal that killed. It had become the story of people who allegedly knew exactly how dangerous that animal had become, and chose to trust their own confidence instead of every warning surrounding them. Soon, that story would leave police headquarters and enter a courtroom. There, 12 ordinary citizens would decide whether those choices amounted to one of the boldest murder prosecutions California had ever attempted. And whatever verdict they reached would change American criminal law forever. By the time the case reached the courtroom, it had already become one of the most closely watched criminal prosecutions in America. Newspapers had followed every development. Television crews gathered outside the courthouse long before each day's proceedings began. Legal scholars debated the charges in classrooms and law offices across the country. Animal behavior experts offered conflicting opinions during interviews. Editorial pages questioned whether prosecutors had gone too far, or whether they had finally recognized a form of criminal responsibility that had existed all along. Everyone agreed on one thing. This trial would become history. Because for perhaps the first time in modern American legal history, a jury would be asked to decide whether the owner of a dangerous dog could be guilty not merely of negligence, but of second-degree murder. The extraordinary publicity surrounding the case created an immediate problem. Finding an impartial jury inside San Francisco proved almost impossible. The city's residents had followed the tragedy from the beginning. Most potential jurors had already formed opinions. Some sympathized deeply with Diane's family. Others questioned the murder charge. Many remembered seeing the news coverage repeatedly. The court recognized the challenge. Justice requires not only fairness, but the appearance of fairness. Eventually, the trial was moved from San Francisco to Los Angeles. The change surprised many observers. Yet the reasoning remained straightforward. The court wanted 12 jurors whose decisions would be based on evidence presented inside the courtroom, not months of media coverage. Even after the venue changed, national attention followed. Every hearing attracted reporters. Every motion generated headlines. Every legal argument was examined by commentators searching for clues about how the unprecedented prosecution might unfold. For Diane's loved ones, however, none of that mattered. To Sharon Smith, the cameras could never capture the empty apartment waiting each evening. To Diane's family and friends, legal theory could never replace the woman whose laughter had disappeared forever. They attended the proceedings carrying grief rather than curiosity. Across the courtroom sat Marjorie Knoller and Robert Noel. Both had spent years practicing law. Now they occupied seats normally reserved for defendants. It was a reversal few could have imagined. Lawyers who had built careers explaining legal responsibility now faced the possibility of criminal conviction themselves. The prosecution began carefully. This was never a case they intended to win through emotion alone. They understood the burden they carried. Charging second-degree murder demanded proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecutors could not simply demonstrate that Diane had died. That had never been disputed. They needed to prove something far more difficult. That Marjorie Knoller knew her conduct endangered human life. Dot unconsciously chose to ignore that danger. Every witness called to the stand served that central argument. Residents from the apartment building described months of fear. One after another, they painted remarkably consistent pictures of life inside the building. The dogs lunged. The dogs growled. The dogs frightened children. The dogs overwhelmed their handlers. Some witnesses admitted they altered their daily routine simply to avoid encountering Bane and Hera. The jury listened carefully. No single testimony established guilt. Together, they created an unmistakable atmosphere. Fear had become normal long before Diane Whipple died. Animal control officials testified next. They explained previous complaints. Prior incidents. Reports documenting aggressive behavior. The records did not portray one isolated mistake. Instead, they suggested a continuing pattern. Again, prosecutors returned to the same question. If so many others recognized the danger, how could the defendants honestly claim they did not? Medical experts then described Diane's injuries. The courtroom became unusually quiet. The testimony remained clinical, measured, professional. Yet the facts required no dramatic language. 77 injuries. Extensive soft tissue destruction. Massive blood loss. Severe trauma to the neck. Doctors explained the desperate efforts made inside San Francisco General Hospital. Blood transfusions. Emergency surgery. Advanced trauma care. Despite everything modern medicine could offer, the injuries proved overwhelming. Some jurors looked downward while photographs were discussed. Others stared directly at the witnesses. The emotional weight of the evidence became increasingly apparent. Veterinary and animal behavior specialists followed. Defense attorneys hoped these witnesses would reinforce an important point. Dogs remain animals. Animals sometimes behave unpredictably. No owner can completely control instinct. The prosecution agreed with part of that argument. No human being can guarantee an animal's behavior. But ownership carries responsibility precisely because unpredictability exists. The issue was never whether dogs possess instincts. The issue was whether those instincts had been ignored despite repeated warnings. Experts describe the Presa Canario breed carefully. They rejected sensationalism. These were not inherently evil animals. When responsibly bred, trained, and managed, they could function successfully. The problem, they explained, emerged when extraordinary physical power combined with inadequate control. Power multiplies consequences. A Chihuahua may bite someone. A Presa Canario weighing more than 100 pounds possesses the capacity to kill. That reality requires corresponding responsibility. The prosecution's case steadily narrowed toward one unavoidable conclusion. Knowledge. Everything depended upon knowledge. Did Marjorie Nola understand the danger? Witnesses suggested yes. Previous incidents suggested yes. Complaints suggested yes. The attack on Diane weeks earlier suggested yes. If the jury believed those facts, implied malice became increasingly plausible. Then came testimony concerning one of the strangest aspects of the entire case. Paul Schneider. Jurors learned about the imprisoned Aryan Brotherhood member. They heard evidence regarding his connection to the dogs. They learned about the extraordinary legal adoption completed by Nola and Robert Noel. The courtroom reacted with visible curiosity. The prosecution never argued that Schneider ordered Diane's death. There was no evidence supporting such a claim. Instead, they used the relationship to explain why the defendants had become deeply invested in keeping and defending the dogs despite mounting concerns. The defense faced a difficult challenge. Their primary argument remained consistent throughout the trial. The attack had been a terrible accident. Nothing more. Defense attorneys insisted Nola never intended anyone to die. She loved her dogs. She believed she could control them. Mistaken judgment, they argued, should not become murder. Several witnesses described Nola attempting to restrain Bain during the attack. Defense lawyers emphasized those efforts repeatedly. A murderer, they suggested, does not try to stop the event. The prosecution responded immediately. Intent to kill had never been their theory. Second-degree murder under implied malice required something different. Knowing the risk. Ignoring it anyway. Those two legal philosophies collided throughout the trial. The defense emphasized the unpredictability of animals. The prosecution emphasized the predictability of human decisions. Closing arguments became the emotional center of the proceedings. The prosecution reminded jurors that this case had never depended upon one terrible afternoon. It depended upon every month leading toward that afternoon. Every warning. Every complaint. Every opportunity to change course. Every decision not to act. The fatal attack, prosecutors argued, represented the foreseeable outcome of choices made repeatedly over time. The defense urged jurors to resist creating dangerous legal precedent. If an owner could be convicted of murder after a dog's unexpected attack, where would criminal responsibility end? They warned against allowing sympathy for Diane to replace careful legal analysis. The jury retired to deliberate. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited continuously. Television broadcasts interrupted regular programming whenever updates appeared. Legal analysts predicted every possible outcome. Some believed the murder charge reached too far. Others believed acquittal would signal that obvious dangers carried no meaningful criminal consequences. Inside the jury room, 12 citizens examined evidence accumulated over months of investigation. Witness testimony. Medical evidence. Animal control reports. Expert opinions. Legal instructions defining implied malice. Hours passed. Then another day. No one outside knew which direction deliberations were moving. Finally, the jury returned. The courtroom filled quickly. Everyone stood as the jurors entered. Silence settled over the room. The foreperson handed the verdict forms to the clerk. One by one, the findings were read aloud. Marjorie Knoller. Guilty of second-degree murder. Guilty of involuntary manslaughter. Robert Knoll. Guilty of involuntary manslaughter. The significance of those words extended far beyond the courtroom. For Diane's loved ones, no verdict could restore what had been taken. Justice does not erase grief. It cannot replace birthdays never celebrated or conversations forever unfinished. But the decision acknowledged something deeply important. The law recognized that this tragedy had not resulted solely from animal instinct. Human responsibility stood beside it. After the verdict, sentencing followed. Marjorie Knoller ultimately received a prison sentence reflecting the seriousness of the murder conviction. Robert Knoll received a lesser sentence consistent with the manslaughter verdict. Both appealed. Years of additional legal proceedings followed. Higher courts reviewed complex questions surrounding implied malice and jury instructions. Certain rulings required reconsideration of aspects of the conviction, leading to further hearings. Ultimately, however, the finding that Knoller acted with conscious disregard for human life was reaffirmed, and the second-degree murder conviction remained in place. The legal battle lasted years. The consequences lasted even longer. For law professors, the case became required reading. For prosecutors, it became an example of how implied malice could apply beyond traditional homicide cases. For defense attorneys, it illustrated the importance, and the controversy, of expanding criminal liability. For the public, it permanently changed the conversation surrounding dangerous animals and their owners. Meanwhile, outside every legal textbook, another reality remained unchanged. An apartment in Pacific Heights still stood. A hallway eventually received fresh paint. Neighbors gradually resumed ordinary routines. New residents moved into the building, many unaware of the history beneath their feet. Life continued because life always continues. But for everyone who had lived through January 26, 2001, that hallway would never again be just another hallway. It had become the place where confidence, ignored warnings, and preventable choices collided with irreversible tragedy. And although the courtroom had finally delivered its judgment, one question continued echoing long after the verdict was read. Could Diane Whipple still be alive if even one warning had been taken seriously? It was a question no court could answer. Yet it remained at the heart of the case that changed American criminal law forever.